Hey everyone, Tactics here, and I've noticed a lot of conversations recently regarding affixes in Mythic Plus, so what better time to put out a fun little tier list video here where I rank my favorite and least favorite seasonal affixes of all time, including thundering the first season of Dragonflight seasonal affix. Luckily, I did actually play with all of these seasonal affixes when they were released, so I do at least have kind of some sense for how they felt from a player's perspective. So we're going to do this in chronological order here. So we're starting off with the very first seasonal affix ever made, Infested, themed after the boss that tier Gahoon. And who could have predicted the very first try at this wasn't actually so great? As a refresher here, I have the full list from Wowhead. Basically what this did is some random mobs throughout the actual dungeon had a little like infested buff on them, and basically if you killed them, they would spawn this worm and you would need to kill that worm, otherwise it would jump into someone else, and basically these mobs would kind of just heal all nearby mobs. So pretty annoying. A lot of the strategies actually involve like CCing some of these mobs and like pulling packs away, that kind of thing. So overall, very annoying affix, absolutely no upside, which you'll notice from a lot of these original seasonal affixes. They were not Kiss Curse whatsoever, and I think that kind of shows in how good the affix was. Very annoying. Only really healed mobs, just made dungeons longer. I'm putting this down in the D tier. Unfortunately, one of our worst seasonal affixes ever, but luckily they did keep iterating on seasonal affixes and they definitely got better over time. Moving on, we have Reaping. This is an affix that is looked back on very fondly. Basically, every so often, every on trash count percentage, all the mobs you killed would spawn into one of like I think 3, maybe 4 different types of mobs, and they would just run at you from wherever you killed them. They wouldn't aggro anything, luckily, and they would have like a few easy abilities you can see on the screen here that they would have, not too difficult to deal with. Basically, you just mass AoE these guys down. A lot of times in higher keys, you would like LOS them, maybe pull them on top of a pack or a boss or something like that, and just like mass AoE. Pretty fun. A lot of people enjoyed it. Personally, I don't have any like rose tinted goggles for Reaping. It was a fine affix, so I'm probably actually gonna upset some people here, and I'm gonna put it actually only in the B tier. It was okay. I don't think it was terribly good. I don't think it was bad. It's obviously much better than some of the later affixes we're going to cover in this list. But I'm not going to put it much higher than B. I just don't think it was that great of an affix. It was fine. The mass AoE is fun, but especially coming from like a tank's perspective, look, big AoE, sure, but it's not really the biggest deal for me personally. Next up, we go down a little bit here. We've got Beguiling. So this is the Ashara based one, and I actually think there was a comment here that kind of explained it. So basically, there were these 3 types of emissaries, as you can see down here, that would spawn throughout the dungeon. There was the Void Touched Emissary, which would do AoE shadow damage in LOS. There was the Enchanted Emissary, which would cause nearby mobs to reflect damage. And then there was the Tides Emissary that would cause mobs to be immune to stuns, crowd controls, and interrupts. Notably, 2 of these you did have to actually like quote unquote kill in the Void Touch and the Tide, but the Enchanted one you would usually just have like one person assigned to kind of knock it back from the pack, because any direct damage would cause it to back up and it would just disappear after 20 seconds here. So honestly, this was not a very good affix. The other thing to note about this affix is that the number of emissaries of each type would kind of rotate. There would be weeks where like one emissary was dominant, so that would have like more emissaries of that type show up, and that added RNG factor was just such a pain too. And again, just like that's what Inspiring obviously was inspired by, the Tide emissary here, and obviously Inspiring, as we know, was here for one expansion before being removed. So not a very well liked affix. Again, just kind of like the Infested affix, just a giant pain in the butt to deal with. This at least didn't really add much health, but it certainly made pulls considerably more annoying or dangerous with the reflect damage if you ever let that go off, or the not being able to CC or interrupt, that kind of thing. And so I'm also going to drop that down in the D tier here with Infested. Now that brings us to the final affix of Battle for Azeroth, Awakened, which I am going to throw up in the S tier. I think this is probably one of, if not the best seasonal affix to ever be made. What this was, basically you could click these obelisks placed throughout the dungeon, and it would take you into this phase of the dungeon where none of the other mobs would be able to see or aggro or fight you, and you would just have the mini boss associated to that pylon there, and wherever you killed that mini boss, wherever you are when it dies, you get teleported out into that part of the dungeon. So you could use these to skip across large areas of the dungeon without needing like a rogue, or even just doing absolutely massive skips in some cases as well. Very interesting for routing, I found. It helped to not limit group comps, and also if you didn't want to waste time single targeting a mini boss down, you could actually fight the last boss, skip the pylons, and then when you engage the boss, they would get the some benefits from having that pylon up and spawn some mobs, that kind of thing. So if you didn't want to use them, you didn't have to. So you had that choice there. It was really, really fun to play with. I guess there was also corruption in this patch, but that might be biasing it. But pushing with Awakened and Corruption was really, really fun. I really enjoyed this Affix, especially as a group that didn't have like a rogue at the time, so you weren't able to do all those shroud skips. You all of a sudden could do a lot of skips because of Awakened. And it was just really fun Affix as a player, so I'm putting that up in the S tier. Now we're moving into the Shadowlands Affixes, with the very first one being Prideful. And I kind of struggled where to place this one. So for those who know, for me, I started to actually push keys a little bit with Awakened, so maybe a little bias there, but that kind of rolled into Shadowlands where I was actually pushing keys, and that's where Prideful gets a bit divisive, I would say. So me personally, I think I'm going to put it down in the C tier. I think the biggest problem with Prideful, one, I don't like affixes that spawn on trash percent. So if we look at Prideful, here, it spawns every 20% count, so you would get 5 total. Prideful, similar to Reaping. I think Reaping was like 33% count. So I'm not a big fan of that. I think it limits kind of routing a little bit, unlike Awakened, which kind of does the complete opposite. But I think my bigger problem with Prideful was the actual scaling of the manifestation that spawned. So basically, this guy just scaled way, way, way too hard with key level, to the point where like in a 15, I think like if you were someone doing weekly 15s in Shadowlands, you probably really like Prideful. I think it was pretty good in 15s. But if you started pushing to 20s and above 20s in the first season of Shadowlands, damn, these guys were extremely annoying. They just scaled so hard, to the point where you had to start committing both defensive CDs and offensive CDs to actually survive the Prideful, and then you didn't actually get much benefit from the damage or move speed healing, whatever amp at the end of it, because you had committed all your damage to actually kill the Prideful itself. The strat in hierarchies actually involved skipping a lot of these guys entirely with like invis pots, well-timed invis pots. You could actually skip the spawn of these guys. Also, if you just killed the last trash mobs after you've killed the last boss, you didn't need to fight the 100% Prideful. So strategies like that became popular in a lot of dungeons and hierarchies. And any time where you're just trying to completely ignore the seasonal affix, I don't think it's really a great one. So again, divisive opinion here. For someone who did mediocre high keys, not actually high keys, but to the point where Prideful's got annoying, I was not the biggest fan of this affix, but I can definitely see why some people who did only like weekly 15s, that kind of thing, did enjoy this affix. Then we move on to Tormented. I'm going to put Tormented here up above Prideful in the B tier. So these again were very similar to the mini bosses. So there's 4 mini bosses in every single dungeon. Where is it? There it is. We've got the 4 mini bosses available in every single dungeon. 2 of these switched locations, which is actually, I'm sorry, how Awakened work. I don't think I mentioned that, but 2 of the mini bosses would rotate positions in each dungeon, and 2 would be static. Exactly the same for the Tormented mini boss, and each had a set of anima powers for every role to choose from. This was static. There wasn't much RNG in that sense, so that was nice. You also had the ability to play these guys on the last boss, quote unquote, where they had aura buffs, and if you didn't kill them, the last boss would get those aura buffs. You wouldn't have to fight anything, you would just get aura buff. So lots of aura skipping, which would put a massive slow on everyone, which was holy, that was pain. But I liked the idea. I like the fact that you had the choice to either get the powers on some of these mini bosses or skip the powers and make the last boss harder. I like that idea. Maybe the powers could have been distributed a little bit better, because like Oros, I believe he was all utility powers, something like that, and he wasn't really played much because he didn't get much throughput, if I recall correctly, actually. But in general, like there were some very, very strong powers, and there were some powers that were like never used at all. So there's little problems like that. But I think in general, it was overall not a terrible affix. I'm still putting it below Reaping, because I think a lot of times, Oros final bosses, a lot of them, oh my gosh, I have I have some pretty fun memories of those. But overall, I did, I think, enjoy this season. I think a bigger problem for this season was the fact that it was 9.1, which was in general not a very well liked time in World of Warcraft, right? Sanctum of Domination, a very long content drought. I think a lot of people I knew at the time quit during that patch, so I think that's maybe biasing this affix in a bit of a negative light. I don't think the affix was actually too bad, though, putting it in the B tier. That brings us to Encrypted, the Season 3 affix, and this is going to be my second S tier affix. I'm not sure which one I would put higher here. I'm leaving Awakened as the highest one here, Encrypted right behind it, but basically you had the three kind of little orbs that would spawn on different packs. You had the orb, the Vi orb, and the Woe orb. There it is. Again, the Woe orb. If you killed it, each one would spawn a different mini boss, which would then give you a different power whenever you killed that mini boss. So you could kind of somewhat control when you got this buff, which would be good for like skips with the Woe buff, the massive speed and the stealth. You had the massive amount of haste from the Vi buff, or the big CDR from buff and health regen, which is very interesting to play with. Obviously, lots of people love CDR, but also the defensive aspect of was pretty interesting as well, to use as like the HP regen during scary moments of fights near the beginning, so you didn't have to commit like defensives or healing seeds or that kind of thing. So that's interesting for sure. I really liked it. They made so much flexibility, like Awakened, in routing, because there were so many of these little orbs sprinkled throughout dungeons. You could all of a sudden do like these tiny little micro skips throughout dungeons, skip like one pack and go whatever, do the next thing. You didn't need a rogue, but the rogue added even more flexibility to this, because you could like woe past something and then shroud back, then woe past it again, that kind of thing. So really interesting routing adjustments made from this affix, and I think those clearly, being my top two affixes, are always my favorite things that when it comes to seasonal affixes. Just the ability to have a major impact on your routing, I think, is really cool. Plus, of course, you had the CDR aspect of this, which people always love as well. CDR is really cool. So I'm putting that up in the S tier with Awakened. That leaves Shrouded, the final seasonal affix of Shadowlands here in Season 4. I'm going to put that in the A tier here. So these are basically, you had the Nathrazim kind of randomly, not randomly, they were spawned throughout dungeons, and then there was one mini boss Nathrazim, and whenever you killed the one, you would get a stack based of stats based on what you picked at the beginning of the dungeon, and the big mini boss, which I think most people skipped in every single dungeon because he just scaled too crazy, kind of like the Prideful thing. He would actually give multiple stacks of that buff, so killing him was a bigger benefit, but I believe you only ever killed him in dungeons you were forced to kill him in, and people found very interesting ways to skip him as much as possible. So another Prideful situation with him, but in general, it gave a lot of player power in some dungeons. Like by the end of dungeons, you would have a ton of, like, I think usually like haste for a lot of classes, but whatever it was, just a ton of stats, which made you feel like an absolute god by the end of dungeons. Really fun for a final patch for sure. Kind of akin to Corruption with the Awakened seasonal affix. And of course, because the positioning was chosen by Blizzard and it was static, it would sometimes alter your routes to kind of go try and pick up more of these mini bosses, or Nathrazim rather, maybe to avoid the mini boss packs, or go specifically to the mini boss pack with like a Bloodlust, that kind of thing. So I thought it was relatively interesting. They were relatively easy to deal with. Obviously, some things were easier than others. They would like heal if you didn't have great magic mitigation as a tank, which was kind of annoying for certain tank specs. But overall, I did like what this affix did. I don't think it was too impressive. It gave a lot of player power. It was fun to play with, and so I'm putting that up in the A tier. We got Infernal affix here. Infernal. Okay. So this is the Time Walking Legion seasonal affix. I played with this a little bit. Basically, there's like these things you could click on before a few of the bosses, and they would spawn like a different mini boss, and that would give you some buffs when you kill like the Infernals and you see on like an AoE. So it was like, okay, this is kind of like a whatever. Reaping, I'll put this down in the C tier, I think. Not the biggest fan of it. I didn't play it that much, to be honest with you. I didn't do a ton of Legion Time Walking, did a bit. It's kind of like a poor man's Reaping, I think. It gave you a damage buff at least. Some of the mini bosses were a little bit more annoying than others. I think the spider lady was pretty annoying to deal with, but honestly, it was mostly just a mass AoE fest. Kill the Infernal, soak the buff, and get some damage going into the boss kind of deal. It was okay. It was whatever. I'll probably leave Prideful above it because I do think Prideful has that bigger upside in like the mid to lower level keys. So yeah, putting that in the C tier. Not too much to talk about there. I didn't really play it that much, to be honest with you. That brings us to Dragonflight's Thundering Seasonal Affix, and I think I'm gonna drop this down at the bottom of the C tier. I've played with this obviously a decent bit so far in the season, and I think my biggest problems with Thundering is kind of actually similar to Prideful as well. So the way it scales with some Affixes is something I didn't mention with Prideful. The biggest problem was Grievous. Grievous scaled with Prideful, and similarly Grievous scaled with Tormented as well. One of the mini bosses was pretty rough with that, and those are always very, very annoying to deal with. A lot of these other affixes, they didn't really scale much with anything, and all in the A tier and above didn't really scale with anything, right? But some of these ones down here, right, the Prideful and the Tormented scaling with Grievous, Thundering, having some really, really annoying interactions, not only with boss mechanics in general, whenever you need to spread or stack or whatever, having the swirlies be on the ground can be annoying as they hide underground effects. It's really, really bad with quaking, kind of annoying with volcanic. It just has a lot of bad interactions with other affixes. It gives you that 30% damage buff, which is like an okay damage buff, but it's not enough to like really notice, but enough that you feel bad for clearing that buff early, making it an absolute like nightmare in pugs because people don't want to clear it. Almost like requires a weak aura to play, which is kind of annoying for sure, especially for, you know, just your average like pug 15, pug 20 player. Definitely not ideal. And I really do think this one kind of missed the mark a little bit. It happens very, very often, and every single one of these Thundering occurrences is kind of like a pass-fail wipe check almost, because if you mess up, for example, and it's like your tank gets frozen for whatever reason. I know the recent change to make tanks always be the same color is good for sure, but even after that, right, like if you mess up a clear, your tank gets frozen, it's a full wipe, right? Your tank's not living a 5 or whatever second stun the Thundering fail is. I think it's overly punishing. I think it scales too poorly with a bunch of affixes. I think the benefit is in that kind of weird range where it's like good, people want to keep it, but they don't really notice it. So they feel bad for clearing. It's just kind of in a weird area, and I'm not the biggest fan of it. I just think it missed the mark a little bit there. But there we have it, guys. That's my tier list for Mythic Plus seasonal affixes. I would love to hear what you guys think, though. Do you agree with my list? What's your favorite? What's your least favorite seasonal affix of all time? Let me know down in the comments below. If you want to do this for yourself, I'll also link the tier list I did here down in the description. Big shout out to all of my supporters over on Patreon. I appreciate all that you guys do for me. Otherwise, thanks everyone so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.